The Mother Goose Madman by Betty Wren Wright. Only one thing distinguished the letter, the one that was the start of the terror, from the 20 letters she had already opened. The others were addressed to children's book editor, Webster Publishing Company. This one was addressed to Julia Martell, editor of children's books. Julia noticed the distinction, but took no pleasure in it. She preferred to have her name unknown, to be anonymous in her job. That was because her job so often consisted of rejecting stories, of saying no to people. As a rule, she barely glanced at the letters that accompanied the manuscripts, but turned at once to the stories themselves. Julia opened the envelope, unfolded the single sheet of paper, and read.
Dear Miss Muffet,
The letter began. Julia sighed at this too cute approach and went on reading.
Under separate cover, please find my contribution. It has been planned with you in mind and no one else. I hope it proves useful. If not, you will hear from me again. Believe me, you will. Sincerely, J. Smith.
Curious, Julia glanced over the packages on her desk, looking for one addressed in the same handwriting as the letter. It was there, stamped fragile and handle with care, in a half-dozen places. Fred Thompson stopped beside her desk, his arms full of artboards. He looked with amusement at the markings on the package. "Must be worth its weight in gold," he said.
Then it's not worth much.
Julia said dryly.
It's so light that it almost feels empty.
Julia slipped off the wrappings. The box was filled with thin, feathery strips of paper, put there, it seemed, to cushion something delicate inside. Within, a bit of black color showed through. Julia moved the scraps of paper aside. Her first reaction was disbelief, but there it was, the spider's black, hairy body drawn up over folded legs, the tremor of its body as the paper was shifted. Then the legs moved.
Oh!
She exclaimed.
Oh no!
She recoiled because of her dread of all crawling things, while Fred slammed the heavy artboards down on the spider. The brightly lit drugstore was just a few blocks from her home. Julia stopped there every evening on her way from the bus to pick up a newspaper. Often she would reorder the eyewash that made her hours of reading possible. Possibly she liked the store because it reminded her of the one in which she had worked during her college days. Certainly her feeling about the place had nothing to do with the clerks and pharmacist who came and left with monotonous regularity. Now, Julia waved her prescription at the white-coated man in the back of the store. She put the slip of paper on the counter, picked up a newspaper, and dropped a few coins next to the prescription. "Anything else?" the man called to her.
No.
Julia said, but with some reluctance. The cheerful store was especially soothing after the unpleasantness of the afternoon. Partly, of course, it was the fuss everyone had made over her that disturbed her. There was Fred, his eyes showing more concern than his comments. Then there were the copy readers and the secretaries who had conjectured about Miss Muffet and her spider until it was time to go home. Even Mr. Webster had come in, curious about the excitement in the usually subdued editorial offices. Julia hated their attention, which threatened to break through the barriers she had built around herself. It wasn't easy to maintain those barriers, to keep so much to herself. She knew that acting that way was not only difficult, but also probably wrong. Yet for her, it was the only way. This was the way she had decided to be. It was part of the bargain she had made with herself after her husband had died. But it was more than the attention of her co-workers that had upset her. Julia considered this as she left the store and hurried down the street to her own apartment building. And it was more than the fact of the spider. Page 48. She was disturbed because there was somewhere a person who called himself J. Smith, a person who she felt hated her with a very real hate. She, who had tried so hard to remain aloof and detached, was caught in the entanglements of another person's deep emotion. At her apartment house, Julia opened the door of her mailbox and took out a handful of letters. There were bills, 2 invitations to upcoming book conferences, a letter from her aunt writing to thank her for a birthday present, and an envelope addressed to Julia Martell, editor of children's books. She put the other letters into her bag, opened the door of the elevator, and stepped inside. She opened the envelope almost eagerly. She saw at once that it was the same kind of paper with the same very thin, clear handwriting, but she also saw that the salutation was different.
Dear Miss Humpty Dumpty, did you enjoy my first submission? Expect another one soon.
The elevator lurched upward. Julia put out her hand to the emergency stop button, but hesitated and did not touch it. The elevator slowed, halted. The doors opened, and she faced her familiar hallway with its light gray carpeting. She stepped out and waited for her heart to stop its violent thumping.
Humpty Dumpty had a great fall.
It wouldn't be, thought Julia, in the elevator, or here in the hallway where one of the other tenants might be the victim, but it might be inside her apartment, or possibly... She turned into the shadowy corner corridor that led to her own door. If she had been moving along at her usual brisk pace, she would have had a very bad fall. But caution had slowed her steps. As it was, when the wire barely brushed against her left ankle, she stopped at once. She looked closely and saw a thin, gray wire, the same shade as the carpeting, stapled to the paneling on both sides of the corridor, about 3 inches above the floor. From the few feet away, it could hardly be seen. After a moment, Julia took a white linen handkerchief from her bag and draped it over the wire to serve as a warning to anyone who might be walking that way. Inside her apartment, she looked carefully in the bedroom, the kitchen, the bath. Then she came back into the living room and called the police. The next morning, Julia took the files of rejected manuscripts into the small conference room and closed the door behind her. If, as the police believed, her correspondent was a disappointed and disgruntled amateur writer, a fanatic whose story had been rejected, she would determine his identity herself. His handwriting was distinctive, thin and clear, with unfinished loops on some of the letters, a slanted cross on the T's, narrow O's. She would recognize that handwriting. In the files, there was only one letter from a J. Smith. The handwriting, barely legible, was accompanied by a story about the writer's childhood. It was signed Jack Smith, age 89. The letter was 2 years old. It doesn't seem likely he's the one, thought Julia. Patiently, she began searching through the files again. The lieutenant had warned her that J. Smith was probably a pseudonym, and common sense told her that the writer, even though he had taken no pains to disguise his handwriting, would hardly sign his own name to what could be evidence against him. She was halfway through the 3rd drawer of the files when the door opened and Fred came in.
"Any luck?"
She shook her head.
"Everybody's guessed what you're doing in here,"
he said.
"and at least 6 people volunteered to help your secretary sort your mail this morning. They didn't find a thing."
Julia looked unhappy.
I wish they'd just forget it.
She said.
The whole thing is silly. I wish everyone would forget it.
Her tone was sharper than she had intended, and his reply matched it.
"What's eating you?"
he asked, and it was as if the question had been there for a long time, waiting to be asked.
"Just why? Why don't you want people to care about you? Is that a crime in your book?"
They stared at each other.
"End of conversation,"
said Fred, after a long moment of silence.
"Full stop. Now, how about dinner at Charlie's tonight? All the spaghetti you can eat and extra meatballs on request."
No thanks.
"We can discuss politics. Who's going to win the pennant this year?"
Thanks anyway.
Afterward, staring at the closed door, she thought how pleasant it would have been to have said yes. He was a nice fellow, fun to be with, and gentle in his way. It was later than 5 o'clock before Julia had completed checking the last file. Nowhere had she come across the handwriting like the writing in the letters. The day had been largely wasted, and it had taken her much longer than she had thought it would. The trouble was that she found it impossible to simply glance at the letters and put them aside. She found herself poring over the letters, searching for any clue J. Smith was there somewhere. Of that she was sure. Her secretary looked in to say she was leaving, but Julia remained at the conference table. She had gone through the files. She had taken out every letter that made a reference to Mother Goose. These were stacked before her in a neat pile, ready to be checked again. There were letters criticizing the rhythm of the old verses, and letters praising the Webster Company's 2-volume edition. There were letters asking the meaning of a particular poem or offering an explanation of another. One of them was written on stationery marked Ravensfoot Sanitarium, Belden, Colorado. It was dated February 11th. Julia found it quite moving. Dear Editor, I am sending you my original modern Mother Goose rhymes for modern children. During my illness, I have passed many hours making up these little poems which I feel would have appeal for today's children. I am allowed to sit up for a half hour every day, and during that time I have copied the poems by hand. I don't mention this to gain sympathy, but to show you how deeply in earnest I am about the value of the verses. Thank you for your consideration. The letter was signed Dorothy Kesselman. A note indicated that the standard printed rejection letter had been sent out February 16th. Julia picked up the phone.
Will you get me the Ravensfoot Sanitarium in Belden, Colorado, please?
She asked the late hours operator.
I want to speak to the doctor who...
Page 50.
Is caring for Dorothy Kesselman?
Julia waited, holding the letter in her hand, until the operator called her back. Then she listened without comment to what the operator said. When the operator finished speaking, Julia thanked her and asked her to call Lieutenant Schwartz at the police station.
This is Julia Martel,
she said when the lieutenant answered.
I think I have something for you to look into. Dorothy Kesselman sent us some original Mother Goose nursery rhymes 2 months ago, and we returned them with our standard rejection letter. It seems she was ill with advanced tuberculosis, and she died the day she received the letter. The hospital in Colorado, where she was a patient, says her husband, Adolf, moved to this city after his wife's death.
Without question, there was a touch of spring in the air when Julia got off the bus that night and walked up the block. In front of the old brick houses near the corner, a forsythia was beginning to bloom, its yellow buds poking above the green. Julia looked at the narrow windows of the houses and wondered about the people behind them. Were they happy? Were they lonely? Had any of them ever noticed her as she returned night after night? At the drugstore, one of the women who worked part-time was behind the counter. Julia collected a paper, some magazines, and her medicine, which was wrapped and waiting for her.
How are you tonight?
Julia asked as she paid for the items, and was aware that the woman stared in surprise at the greeting.
It's spring,
Julia added, foolishly. Outside again, Julia walked quickly toward her apartment building. When she entered the foyer, she tried to pass the mailbox without looking into it, but she could not ignore the white envelope seen through the little slot in the box.
Dear Miss Peep-Peep, I don't know if you are much of a swimmer or a mountain climber, but it doesn't matter. The name fits, or soon will. This is my last submission, one which you have earned by your sympathy, your compassion, and your understanding. Sincerely, J. Smith.
Julia read the letter twice. Then she rang for the elevator and rode up to her floor. She crossed the corridor with slow, careful steps, ones designed to reveal any invisible obstacles. When she opened the door, she stood back a moment before going inside. It could be anything this time. She had never heard of Peep-Peep. The living room appeared just as she had left it. She looked around the rest of the apartment, and then, with her coat still on, took her complete Mother Goose from the shelf and thumbed through the index. It was there, a short riddle rhyme about a star.
I have a little sister, they call her Peep-Peep. She wades the waters deep, deep, deep. She climbs the mountains high, high, high. Poor little creature, she has but one eye.
The telephone rang. Julia picked it up and heard the voice of Lieutenant Schwartz.
You can relax, he told Julia. We've got your joker. Picked him up right after you called us. Good thing you tipped us off. You were right on the money. The husband of the Mrs. Kesselman who wrote you. He admitted it right away. Went off the deep end after his wife died. He says she worked for 6 months on the poems she sent you, and you didn't even... Well, he seems to think that if you had sent a word of encouragement instead of a form letter, it would have made a difference. She was practically staying alive for your answer, according to him, and when it came, she just gave up.
Julia leaned back.
Yes.
She said,
I'm sorry about that. I understand you, Lieutenant. But it wasn't fair, was it? I mean, to put all that responsibility on me?
The lieutenant sounded uncomfortable.
He says he wrote you a letter that should have tipped you off, he said. He knew he was going to be caught at this, but he didn't care. Anyway, you don't have to worry anymore.
Do I know him?
Could be.
Lieutenant Schwartz seemed relieved to get off the delicate subject of motive.
At least you've seen him. He's the pharmacist in the drugstore just down the block from your place.
Julia returned the receiver to its hook and sat for a long time in thought, without moving. She then picked up the bottle of eye wash from the coffee table and unwrapped it. Her handkerchief was lying on the table, and she poured a little of the liquid from the bottle onto the cloth. The spot widened, and then, as she watched, the dampened area shredded and dissolved. Through the small round hole, she saw the wood of the coffee table turn yellow.
Poor little creature, she has but one eye.
Julia looked around the room that had been for a long time her cheerful, safe retreat. Then she picked up the telephone directory and began turning the pages.
Fred?
She said a moment later.
This is Julia. Are the spaghetti and meatballs still available? I think I like them very much.